A wild horse, with a disheveled coat and eyes carrying a tale of sorrow, unexpectedly became the unlikely protector of a young girl. Yet as its presence stirred unease within the community, suspicious glances and endless murmurs led to the involvement of the animal control authorities. Amid escalating tension, the horse revealed extraordinary courage, leaving everyone questioning, could compassion and trust overcome fear and prejudice to save a lost soul? Join us as we explore this question in today's story. The sun was setting behind the ancient trees of a quiet suburban neighborhood, painting the grassy field behind Mia's house with a gentle hue of orange and gold. The stillness of the evening was punctuated only by the rustling leaves swayed by the breeze and the steady chirping of crickets as twilight descended. The long shadows cast by the weathered wooden fence stretched across the ground like overlapping memories, evoking a sense of tranquility tinged with nostalgia. Amidst this serene setting stood Chex, the wild horse with a sun-scorched coat and a long scar running down its side. It grazed silently on patches of dry grass, its weary posture and sorrowful eyes telling a story without words, a tale that only the patient could unravel. Mia, a 12-year-old girl with soft brown hair and bright, curious eyes, perched on the old fence, her legs swinging idly in the cool air. Her gaze was fixed intently on Chex's every movement. Though she dared not approach too closely, her eyes reflected both curiosity and empathy. Hidden in her jacket pocket were crumbs of old bread, a small secret shared only between her and Chex. "Mia, are you out there again?" Her mother's voice rang out from the kitchen window, slightly sharper than usual, breaking the evening's stillness. Startled, Mia turned her head, a faint smile forming on her lips. "I'm just watching, Mom. I won't get too close." Her mother frowned, wiping her hands on an old dish towel. Her tone grew more stern. "I've told you many times, Mia. Wild horses are not like the ones in your storybooks. They can be dangerous. Come inside and eat dinner." Mia didn't respond immediately. She glanced back at Chex, still grazing as if unaware of her mother's warnings. The horse's mane fluttered gently in the breeze, a scene so picturesque it seemed lifted from a painting. Mia whispered to herself, recalling her late father's words. "Kindness may sometimes put you in danger, but it's always worth it." That night, as the silence of darkness enveloped the house, Mia was abruptly awakened by a loud neighing echoing from the field. The sound was sharp and prolonged, carrying a sense of urgency like a cry for help from the depths of a soul. She sat up quickly, her small feet touching the cold wooden floor. Her heart pounded as curiosity wrestled with fear. Mia tiptoed to the window, pulling the curtain aside gently. Pale moonlight blanketed the field in a silvery glow. In the distance, the silhouette of Chex stood motionless, its reflective eyes gleaming like melancholic gems. But aside from the figure of the horse, nothing seemed amiss. "Mia, go back to bed," her mother's voice called from the adjacent room, pulling her back to reality. Mia sighed and returned to her bed, but her mind remained restless. Sleep eluded her as her thoughts lingered on Chex. The next morning, Mia awoke earlier than usual. The sky was still a muted gray, with the first hints of dawn creeping through the clouds. She hastily wrapped a slice of bread and tucked a small towel into her pocket, determined to approach Chex differently that day. When she reached the field, Chex was already there, as if waiting for her. But today, its eyes seemed wearier than usual, its movements slower and more deliberate. A faint unease stirred within Mia's heart. "Good morning, Chex," Mia murmured, her voice soft and soothing, careful not to startle it. Chex lifted its head, its deep, soulful eyes meeting hers. "It's okay," she continued, taking slow, measured steps forward. She extended her hand, holding out the piece of bread, willing her trembling fingers to stay steady. Chex hesitated, its body tensing as it stepped back slightly. But then, as if sensing her sincerity, it leaned forward, sniffing her outstretched hand before gently taking the bread with its soft lips. Mia's lips curved into a small, triumphant smile as she felt the warm breath of the horse against her hand. But the tranquil moment was abruptly shattered by a sharp voice from a distance. "Mia, what are you doing? Get away from that horse now. It's dangerous!" Chex recoiled instantly, retreating several steps, its eyes filled with alarm. Mia turned to see Mrs. Amanda, their stern and opinionated neighbor, standing with her hands on her hips, her piercing gaze fixed on Chex. "It's fine, Mrs. Amanda," Mia stammered, her voice tinged with nervousness. "I think it just needs some time to trust." "Trust?" Mrs. Amanda scoffed, her skeptical tone unwavering. "Wild horses are unpredictable, Mia. You're lucky it didn't hurt you." Mia didn't reply. She lowered her gaze to Chex, who stood motionless, his eyes still filled with caution. That was when she noticed the tattered bridle hanging loosely around his neck. The worn-out leather seemed like a quiet reminder that Chex wasn't entirely wild. He had once belonged to someone who had been part of a family. But now the scars on his body and the sadness in his eyes told a story of abandonment and aimless wandering. Word about Chex spread quickly throughout the neighborhood. People began murmuring every time they saw Mia heading out to the field. Whispers filled with prejudice reached her ears. Wild horses shouldn't be around children. Someone needs to call animal control. Mia heard these comments as she passed by, but she didn't let them shake her resolve. She remembered her father's words, how he had taught her that kindness often had to face disapproving glances and opposition from others. One afternoon, Mia decided to try something different. She brought a small brush, a towel, and some water to the field. Slowly, she approached Chex, maintaining enough distance to avoid scaring him. "Chex, you've been through so much, haven't you?" Mia said softly, her voice gentle yet firm. "But I promise I'll help you." Chex stared at her for a long moment, his deep eyes seeming to soften. Then, slowly, he stepped closer. Mia smiled, cautiously placing the towel on the ground and pouring water into a small bowl before stepping back. Chex sniffed the air, then bent down to drink. The late afternoon sun began to set, casting a reddish glow across the field. Mia stood there, watching Chex, and a strange feeling welled up in her chest, a connection she couldn't explain. At that moment, she knew she would do everything in her power to protect this horse, no matter the prejudice or challenges ahead. One night, Chex's loud whinny pierced the stillness of the suburban neighborhood, shattering the silence. The strange sound of movement from the field followed, startling Mia awake. She rushed to the porch, her bare feet touching the cold wooden floor, her heart pounding in her chest. In the dim light of a distant street lamp, she saw Chex standing tall and unwavering between her house and a shadowy figure. His wild eyes glowed like embers in the night. Chex let out a powerful whinny, his hooves striking the ground with a sharp, commanding force. The intruder hesitated, then retreated into the darkness. Mia stood frozen, her wide eyes filled with astonishment as she realized that Chex had protected her. A mixture of fear and awe coursed through her as she processed what had just happened. The next morning, as the sun bathed the field in warm light, Mia sat by the gate, her mind racing with questions. Chex, the horse she had spent so much time trying to befriend, seemed different now. He was no longer just a wild horse. He was more like a guardian watching over her. But was that truly the case? Mia wasn't sure. She observed Chex from a distance, her gaze both probing and curious. Her father's teachings echoed in her mind. She remembered sitting on the porch as a child, watching him carefully bandage the leg of an injured horse. "Why are you helping it?" she had asked, her small voice tinged with worry. Her father had smiled, his calloused hands gently securing the bandage. "Because it needs someone to show it that the world isn't always so scary," he had said, his voice calm and steady. "Sometimes kindness is the only thing that keeps us from breaking apart." Those memories came rushing back to Mia, clearer than ever. She felt her father's words urging her forward. That evening, as the golden hues of sunset bathed the landscape in soft light, she approached Chex, who stood just a few steps away. His deep eyes followed her every movement. Mia whispered, "You're scared, but so am I. We'll be okay." Chex didn't move, but the tension in his gaze seemed to ease. That night, Mia's mother sat in the kitchen, her expression heavy with worry. Through the faint steam rising from her cup of tea, she watched Mia, who was engrossed in her book under the warm glow of a small desk lamp. "You're spending too much time with that horse," her mother said, her tone stern but laced with concern. Mia looked up, pausing for a moment. "He's not dangerous, Mom. He just needs a little time, a little trust," she replied. Her mother sighed, setting the teacup down on the table. "I know you want to help him, Mia, but wild horses are unpredictable. You need to be careful." Mia sat quietly for a moment, then spoke softly. "Dad always said kindness is worth it, even when it's not easy. Mom, I think Chex deserves a chance." Mia's mother sighed, her eyes shadowed with a hint of sorrow as the mention of her late husband lingered in the air. "Your father always had a big heart," she said softly. "But you must remember kindness needs to be placed where it can truly make a difference." Her voice carried a gentle caution, though it was laced with understanding. As the days passed, the bond between Mia and Chex grew undeniably stronger. Each afternoon, Chex would come closer to the gate, leaving behind what Mia started to call gifts. A tuft of dry grass, a feather, or a frayed piece of rope it had found somewhere. Mia cherished these tokens, carefully storing them away as if they were treasures, believing them to be signs of the growing trust Chex was offering her. One late afternoon, while Mia was sitting near the gate engrossed in her book, she felt a soft nudge against her arm. Looking up, she saw Chex's gentle muzzle pressing against the pages, as if seeking her attention. A burst of laughter escaped her lips, filling the quiet air with warmth. "Do you want me to focus on you instead?" Mia teased, her tone light and playful. Chex let out a soft whinny, its ears perked up in curiosity as if responding to her question. However, not everyone in the neighborhood shares Mia's affection for the horse. Mr. Davis, a stern and outspoken neighbor, was particularly vocal about his disapproval. At a neighborhood meeting, he stood up with a scowl etched across his face. "That wild horse is a danger. Who knows what it might do? We should call animal control before something bad happens," he declared, his voice rising above the murmurs of the crowd. His words garnered murmured agreement from some neighbors, but Mia wasn't about to give up. She stood, her small frame radiating determination. "Chex isn't dangerous," she said, her voice firm despite the quiver of emotion in it. "He just needs a place where he can feel safe." Later that night, a sharp whinny broke through the stillness of the dark. Mia jumped out of bed and ran outside. The cold air bit at her skin as she reached the gate. Under the pale glow of the moon, she saw Chex standing near the entrance, its body tense, eyes fixed on something in the distance. Following its gaze, Mia spotted a shadow moving along the fence, a figure sneaking toward her home. Before she could react, Chex bolted forward, placing itself between Mia and the intruder. Its hooves struck the ground with force, and its powerful presence caused the figure to stumble back and flee into the darkness. Mia stood frozen, her heart racing. Once the threat was gone, she approached Chex, her hands trembling but steady enough to stroke its mane. "You did so well, Chex." "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with gratitude. One late night, as the moon's faint light blanketed the quiet neighborhood, Mia slipped outside, wrapping herself in a thin sweater. The chill of the wind rustled through the old wooden fence, carrying the dry whispers of grass. Chex stood tall under the silver moonlight, its silhouette both majestic and haunting, the worn, tattered rope around its neck, a remnant of its painful past, swayed gently in the breeze. Mia approached cautiously, each step deliberate to avoid startling the horse. Slowly she reached out and touched the frayed rope, her fingers working carefully to untie it. As the rope fell away, her fingers grazed the ridged scars along Chex's neck. These marks, etched into its skin, spoke not only of suffering, but of resilience. "Who could have done this to you?" Mia whispered, her voice catching as tears welled in her eyes. The thought of what Chex had endured tightened her chest. Chex lowered its head slightly, its eyes meeting hers. They were deep and kind, yet burdened with an unspoken sadness. In that moment, Mia felt an overwhelming surge of emotion, a mix of sorrow for its pain, anger toward those who had hurt it, and an unshakable determination to protect the horse at any cost. Over the following days, Chex became an integral part of Mia's life. Every morning she would bring carrots or stale bread to the field, her gentle presence a balm to the wary horse. Chex grew accustomed to her touch, occasionally leaning its head against her as a gesture of trust. Not everyone shared Mia's connection with Chex, though. While Mrs. Isabella, a kind neighbor, often defended the horse, others remained skeptical. "It's just a horse that's been through a lot," Mrs. Isabella told the other neighbors. "It needs peace to heal." But Mr. Davis, always quick to criticize, countered her words sharply. "A wild horse is a threat. What if it gets scared and causes an accident? What if it kicks someone? We can't allow this to continue." At the Wednesday evening neighborhood meeting, tensions were high. Mr. Davis stood up, his tone confrontational. "I've contacted animal control and they'll handle this." He announced his words a challenge to anyone who disagreed. Mia, seated next to her mother, felt her heart pound in her chest. As eyes turned toward her, she gathered her courage and stood up. "Chex isn't dangerous," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. "He's just trying to survive." Mr. Davis scoffed, his voice dripping with condescension. "And what happens when it loses control? Little girl, you're playing with fire." The room fell into an uneasy silence. The weight of the discussion pressed down on Mia's small frame. But before she could respond, her mother rose to her feet. "Risk is part of life," her mother said calmly. "But assuming the worst without understanding isn't fair. Maybe there's a better solution." Despite the debate, unease lingered in the neighborhood. One afternoon, while Mia read on the porch, Chex grazed peacefully nearby. The tranquil scene was interrupted by a rustling sound near the edge of the woods. Looking up, Mia froze as a wild wolf emerged from the underbrush. Its eyes locked onto her. Fear rooted her in place, but before the wolf could approach, Chex sprang into action. The horse charged forward, positioning itself between Mia and the predator. It reared up, letting out a loud, commanding whinny, its hooves striking the ground with authority. The wolf snarled but quickly retreated into the shadows of the forest. From the window, Mia's mother had witnessed everything. She rushed outside, wrapping her arms tightly around Mia. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice shaking. Mia nodded, her gaze fixed on Chex, her protector. The horse stood tall and unyielding, a silent guardian in the fading light. That evening, Mia checked on Chex's temporary stall near the fence. While cleaning up, she discovered an old tattered saddle buried in the hay. The saddle bore faint, almost unreadable carvings, perhaps a name or a place. "Chex, who did you belong to?" Mia whispered, her hand gently brushing the saddle's worn leather. "And why did they abandon you?" The marks only deepened Mia's determination to uncover Chex's past and shield him from the prejudice of others. In the following days, Mr. Davis continued to press for Chex's removal. He filed a formal complaint and demanded an emergency neighborhood meeting, scheduled for Saturday morning. At the meeting, tension crackled in the air. Neighbors gathered in a loose circle, their murmurs echoing like distant thunder. Mrs. Amanda whispered to her husband, while others nodded or shook their heads, casting skeptical glances toward Chex, who stood calmly beside Mia. His coat was still rough, his scar prominent, and his deep brown eyes scanned the crowd as if sensing he was the center of the storm. Mia stood near him, her small hands clenched tightly to hide her nervousness. Chex remained still, exuding a quiet strength, even as he faced the uncertain fate decided by the people before him. Mia's mother stepped forward. Her calm demeanor masked the fire of resolve burning in her eyes. Her voice, steady yet firm, broke through the murmurs. Chex is not just a horse. He has protected my family, and perhaps even this neighborhood. I think we need to see this from a different perspective. He deserves a chance, just like any of us. Her words hung in the air like a stone dropped into a still pond. Some neighbors exchanged uncertain glances. Others fidgeted with unease. Slowly, Mrs. Isabella, a kind-looking woman with silver hair neatly pinned back, stepped forward. "I've seen Chex with Mia," she began, her voice warm but resolute. "He's gentle with her. I've never seen him harm anyone. Perhaps we're being too harsh in our judgment." A ripple of murmurs swept through the crowd like wind rustling through the trees. Some nodded in hesitant agreement, but Mr. Davis, his sharp eyes cutting through the circle, was unyielding. Stepping forward, he raised his voice, each word landing like a hammer. "A horse like that is a liability. Are you willing to risk someone being kicked or trampled just because it's been helpful a couple of times?" Mia's heart clenched as she heard his words, each one striking like a needle in her chest. Her resolve wavered for a moment, but then her mind filled with memories of Chex's unwavering loyalty. She remembered the moment he leapt out of the bushes to save her from the rushing water in the forest, risking his own safety without hesitation. The scar along his side wasn't just a mark of pain, it was a symbol of courage and sacrifice. The tattered bridle around his neck and the scars on his body told a story of abandonment and hardship. But more than that, they spoke of resilience and strength. She thought of her father's words, his voice echoing in her memory. "Sometimes kindness is risky, but it's always worth it." The tension in the air was palpable, as if the entire crowd held its breath. Doubts lingered in their eyes and the whispers grew louder. Just then, the heavy rumble of a truck engine broke through the noise. All heads turned as a white truck, bearing the logo of Animal Control, rolled into the parking lot. Mia's heart sank, dread creeping into her chest. Chex stood close to her, his breath warm against her hand, as though sensing her fear. His eyes grew even sadder, reflecting a quiet resignation as if he understood what was coming. Mia placed a trembling hand on Chex's neck, feeling the steady beat of his heart through his rough skin. She swallowed her fear, determination hardening her gaze. Her mother stepped forward, her posture straight and unwavering, her voice cutting through the growing murmurs. "We won't let this happen. He doesn't deserve to be treated like this." One of the animal control officers, a middle-aged man in a crisp uniform, hesitated. He looked from the crowd to Mia's mother, his tone cautious but professional. "It's your right to keep him," he said, "but you'll need to adhere to strict regulations. If there's any incident, we'll have to intervene." Mia's mother nodded, her voice steady. "We understand, and we'll take full responsibility." Relief flooded Mia's chest, but it was short-lived. From behind, Mr. Davis's cold voice cut through the moment. "This isn't over. Mark my words." Mia watched as he turned and walked away, his steps heavy with disapproval. The icy chill of his threat lingered in the air, but she refused to let it deter her. Her hands tightened on Chex's bridle, her eyes blazing with resolve. Chex, as if sensing her courage, gently lowered his head and nuzzled her shoulder, a silent gesture of gratitude and trust. The crowd began to disperse, their whispers fading into the breeze, but the weight of their doubts remained. Mia knew the battle was far from over. Winning their trust, proving Chex's worth, and changing their hearts would take time, but as she stood beside her loyal companion, she felt a glimmer of hope. Together they would face whatever challenges lay ahead. guided by kindness, courage, and the unbreakable bond between them. In the following weeks, the transformation of Chex became undeniable, like a fairy tale gradually revealing its pages full of light. At Mia's small family farm, where lush green fields stretched out to the horizon, Chex began to adapt to his new life. In the early days, he remained wary, often keeping his distance with watchful eyes that followed every movement around him. But now the horse with sun-bleached fur and a long scar along his side had grown gentle and trusting. The sadness in his eyes had been replaced with a glimmer of hope every time he saw Mia approach with a handful of fresh grass or a tender pat on his neck. One autumn afternoon, as the late-day sunlight painted the fields in shades of gold, Mia sat beneath the shade of a large oak tree, the sunlight glinting off the pages of the book in her hands. A soft breeze carried the earthy scent of soil and dry grass, lending the scene a peaceful stillness. Chex stood close by, his ears flicking slightly as though listening to the faint rustle of pages. He lowered his head and gently nuzzled Mia's shoulder, a quiet gesture of connection. Mia smiled, her small hand stroking the smooth fur of Chex, where the once prominent scar had faded into a faint mark. "You're a good horse, Chex," Mia whispered, her voice warm and full of affection. In the distance, a few neighbors walked by, their gazes no longer filled with doubt or suspicion as they passed. Mrs. Amanda, who had once loudly warned Mia about the dangers of the wild horse, leaned against the fence, her expression softening as she watched Chex peacefully standing beside the girl. "Maybe that horse isn't as bad as I thought," Mrs. Amanda murmured, loud enough for Mr. Smith's, her companion, to nod in agreement. "Yes, he's nothing short of a silent guardian," Mr. Smith's replied, his tone hesitant but laced with acknowledgement. The moment that cemented Chex's place in the community happened on a quiet weekend day when Jimmy, Mia's younger brother, was playing near the fence. Jimmy, a mischievous boy with a mop of golden hair, loved climbing the old wooden rails to get a better view of the fields. But this time, a misstep sent him tumbling toward a patch of sharp thorns near the fence. "Jimmy!" Mia shouted, her book falling to the ground as she raced toward her brother. From a distance, Chex sensed something was wrong. In an instant, he charged forward, his strong legs cutting across the soft earth. Before Mia could reach the scene, Chex positioned his body between Jimmy and the thorny bushes. With a careful motion, he used his muzzle to gently nudge the boy upright, his warm breath steadying the startled child. Jimmy, his eyes wide with surprise, looked up at Chex. He saved me," the boy stammered, his small hand reaching out to lightly touch the horse's nose. Mia arrived at Jimmy's side, her heart swelling with emotion. She wrapped her arms around Chex, tears glistening in her eyes. "You're a hero, Chex." From the porch of their house, Mia's mother had witnessed the entire scene. Her hands clutched a small wooden box, her eyes reflecting a mix of nostalgia and pride. She stepped out onto the field, placing the box on a wooden table under the shade of the oak tree. Opening the lid, she pulled out an old yellowed photograph. "Mia, come here," she called softly, her voice laced with emotion. Mia approached, with Jimmy trailing close behind. The photograph showed a young man standing next to a majestic horse, its coat and eyes strikingly similar to Chex's. "This is your father when he was young," her mother said, her voice catching. The horse in the photo was his best friend. It saved him countless times while he worked out in the fields. Mia stared at the picture, then turned to Chex, her eyes filled with awe. "Do you think Chex was meant to find us, Mom?" she asked. Her mother nodded, her gaze tender as it rested on the quiet horse standing beside her children. "Perhaps it was destiny," she replied softly, her voice blending with the rustle of leaves in the wind. As the sun set, bathing the sky in hues of orange and pink, the field seemed to exude an unmatched tranquility. Chex stood beside Mia, his head resting lightly on her shoulder as if seeking comfort. Jimmy sat nearby, his small hands gently stroking the horse's warm coat. In that moment, Mia remembered her father's words, his voice resonating in her mind as if carried by the evening breeze. Kindness isn't always easy, but it's always worth it. She bowed her head, wrapping her arms around Chex, her heart brimming with gratitude. Across the field, Mrs. Amanda and the other neighbors watched the scene unfold, smiles slowly spreading across their faces. By the day's end, the golden hues of twilight stretched over the fields, enveloping Mia, Chex, and everything around them in a gentle glow. The breeze stirred softly through the grass, carrying with it the sense of earth and sky, as if trying to preserve the moment forever. There in the vast, quiet expanse, it seemed something had shifted, not just for Chex or Mia, but for everyone who had witnessed the story. A once lost horse, a small girl with a big heart, and a community learning to trust again. And what about you? In your life, have there been Chex who crossed your path? Have you ever paused, listened, and given them a chance? Perhaps the answer doesn't need to be spoken, but lies in how you choose to act tomorrow, when someone, or something, needs you. If you've ever experienced a magical moment of friendship between humans and animals, we'd love to hear your story in the comments.